Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tracking Down the Real Problems in today's API Solutions. My name is Tyson Harris, and I'm joined today by our presenter, Synergex Developer Support Team Lead, Phil Bratt. Phil joined the Synergy DE Developer Support Team in 2014 after graduating with a degree in computer science. He has extensive knowledge of the Synergy DE product suite with specialties in .NET technologies and Synergy integration for Visual Studio support. He always also trains new Synergy developers through the Synergy DE Language Essentials program. So we're going to start with Phil's presentation here in just a moment. Just as a reminder for everyone, there will be some time for Q&A after the presentation. So feel free to post any questions that you have if you think of them during the presentation in either the chat or the QA area, and we'll be sure to address those after the presentation is over. If you have any technical issues during the presentation or during the conference at all, please contact classes@synergex.com, and we'll go ahead and post that in the chat for everyone's reference as well. And also, as a last reminder, this session is being recorded, so take that into account. Without further ado, let's kick off Phil's presentation.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Tracking Down the Real Problem in today's API-based solutions. My name is Phil Bratt. I am the team lead of Synergex's developer support department. If you're not aware of us or you really haven't interacted with us a whole lot, just as kind of what we do is we help with the education of our products. We field questions about those products. We help determine bugs and unexpected behavior. And of course, there's a lot of troubleshooting when it comes to issues that occur around the Synergy products or just things have gone awry, right? And so because of this, we do have a unique perspective of going into a situation with a program or a process that we are not wholly familiar with. And so we've been really trying to explore that this year about how that works, how we can be more efficient on these kind of calls, despite only knowing the Synergy product line. But we want to be able to help you come to your when you need to, especially when it comes to a crisis situation or something's gone wrong. And so kind of sharing about that, usually I talk about something that's a little more on the technical end, but today it's going to be more for anyone who is involved in problem solving for their company, anyone who would be on that crisis call, and that pretty much involves anyone could be involved on this, even if you're not there for specifically the troubleshooting aspect. You're involved because just whatever your field is puts you there. So this is going to be a little more specific for software companies as a spin, because we're going to be talking about API-based solutions, software that uses a lot of layers of technology. And so I've broken this into three parts. The first one is we're going to be talking about how to find answers in a real. Then we're going to talk about how APIs, how we deal with those because they complicate troubleshooting, and some techniques to help you out there. And then once we do find the answer for a crisis, what does that crisis reveal to us about what the real problem is? And maybe that's an opportunity for growth, for hardening our programs, our software, hardening our product to help avoid those situations in the future. So hopefully this helps you all out. So start off that dreaded phrase, nothing has changed, said right after something's changed. This is usually code for we don't know what changed. And usually it's, something's affecting our product, but because we have so many layers with API-based solutions that it's one little thing can change and it affects your end, but you don't know what's changed because that's not your field. And because of this, we have a lot of different people with a lot of different expertise and a lot of different backgrounds in what they do. And so how do we navigate that? Well, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping first to help you kind of prepare for these kind of situations. Some things that I would recommend we have on hand, or at least we know who has this on hand before a crisis even begins. And so things that we want to have, because there's so many layers of processes and things that are involved in our entire system program these days. You have different layers, like, it could be on the web, you could have multiple APIs, even some third-party software helping you out. We want to make sure we know where all the documentation is for all of this. We want to make sure that we know where it is, what's available, and or at least know who is familiar with that documentation. And speaking of people who might be familiar with it, is there support available for those products or that or those system services that we might be using. Do they have a help desk email or phone number or some sort of case creation process on the web, so we have those handy, so then if we determine that that product is involved in this situation, we can get them on there and make sure that we have everyone available. And then also logs. Does each process come with a log? Is there logs available for those operating systems, those maybe even the web hosted virtual machines that we're using? Is there any sort of monitoring tool for everything involved, including the hardware itself? Do we have all that available? Or who knows where that's available? Do we have error logs? Where do we find those so we can check those to get an assessment of the situation? And then, of course, do we have a plan? Do you know who's supposed to be in charge of hosting these kind of things? Who's supposed to be on call? What is the process you go through to solve a crisis? Is there a plan? Because if there's a plan and people have a understanding of what the plan is, you want to make sure you know the plan and you stick to it. So once we have the plan, we have the people, we need to start gathering the people who are involved in that plan. And so we have the person who's in charge. This is the director, the person who's mostly directing communication. You want to make sure that you have this person, or maybe this person is you, who is in charge of making sure everyone's there and that everyone is on that problem. Because getting the people is one thing, and you can't really establish what the solution is unless you have the people that are involved with the know-how with you. And so what we're talking about here is we're talking about the internal people that are involved inside the company that know the processes. Do we have everyone we need from that? And then of course external people. Do we have people from support there? Do you have a user maybe that is on the ground familiar with the situation? Because you want to be able to start asking questions, get the information you need, so you need to make sure that everyone's there. The reason this is because we do live in an API heavy environment with lots of different processes that we interact with, a lot of those outside the company, web services, anything like that. We don't really have, like we probably used to, that wizard, right? That person who knows everything. If you have someone like that, then that's great, but it's so many things that happen these days, it's hard to have that one person who knows the whole process altogether, right? And so what we're actually looking for is we're looking at our internal and external people, and by asking the right questions, we can find that one person who has the answer. And maybe they don't know they have the answer, but by asking the right question, you can get the information you need and they can go, aha, that's what the problem is. And so the whole theme about this is someone knows the answer. And because everyone wants to be the hero, but that's not really the point of this. The point is about asking the right questions and being the person who moves the conversation along at a efficient pace that gets down to the main problem, and so then someone can solve it. And so that really, to me, is the MVP of most of these crisis and problems, is someone who actually knows to ask the right questions and gets down to the actual problem and digs into it and finds it. And so we have our problem, we start to unravel those using our questions. It's like a thread. We just start to pull it as information starts coming in. We start figuring out what the problem is and coming to that solution, right? And so this all comes down to asking the right kind of questions. And so what kind of questions do we want to do? Well, the ones we don't want to do is we want to avoid the question of why. Why leads to lectures about how a process came to be, maybe some history in there, which is all interesting things, but this isn't the time or place for that, because what we're really going after is we're just going after the who, what, when, and how. Why also can lead to defensive answers, which in a high pressure situation can start to sound accusatory. Well, why is it that way? And then they get defensive. What we want to do is we want everyone to get along, especially in a high pressure situation, so that we can work efficiently without causing issues or interruptions. And speaking of interruptions, we want to avoid interrupting when people are talking. We'll make sure one person's talking and that they get their full thought out. One thing I tend to do is I don't like having a lot of silence. And so if someone stops and starts thinking, we want to give them time to think and not interrupt that process either. And so that's what we mean by not interrupting on that kind of a situation. The kind of questions we do want to ask, though, is we want questions that get people thinking. We start asking questions about, like, what do you think the problem is? How do you think this happened? And what was going on during that time? Getting people to think about the actual situation and keep them on task for the problem, and so they start thinking about it. You want to kind of trigger those critical thinking skills and problem solving skills by asking those kind of questions and getting them to think about the problem. That's where the focus should be. And all of these help when we are building rapport on that call by making everyone work together, and then we start to create a shared understanding of what the problem is as information comes on, and we'll talk a little bit about that and then in a bit. But first, let's go over some samples that kind of demonstrate my point about what we're talking about when we talk about asking good questions. So here's a sample of why interruptions can be detrimental to your call. So the system went down, interrupted. Why did the system go down? We're not sure. We think, and you don't know why the system went down, and there we get a double whammy, because not only is it an interruption, but this could also be taken as a accusatory statement of someone's lack of knowledge. I mean, maybe it's not their expertise, maybe it's not in their wheelhouse, like this is just the messenger, right? It just happened, we were looking at, and then of course before they can insert about what's going on in the process, we're already asking why are we doing to fix it, which is almost redundant because they were just about to explain. And he says, once again, we're looking into it. And before they can finish that thought, we say, well, we need that system up, which is not a wrong statement. However, almost redundant at this point, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to help them solve the problem. And by interrupting and not letting information get out, we're not getting any closer to the solution, because they're not thinking about the solution because we are interrupting. And so another example is why to avoid whys. This one's pretty straightforward. So they tell you the system went down, running the end of week data cleanup and compression process, whatever that might be. And we say, why do we need to run an end of week data cleanup and compression process? Doesn't really solve the problem, but hey, it might help you learn more about what this end of week data cleanup and compression process is. However, that's not really the goal of what we're going for here, because instead what we see here is we just get a long discussion about what that goes, and it just keeps going and going and going and doesn't really get us any closer to the problem. You might know more, but you could save that until there's not a problem with that end of week data cleanup and compression process, because these crisis situations are not for deep philosophical discussions on why anything happens. It's for getting to the base of a problem. So an example of what helps with asking questions that get people to think. So same scenario, the end of week data cleanup and compression process went down, and instead we say, do you think something went wrong with the process? Getting them to think, getting their opinion about what the problem is. So they're focused on the problem and thinking it over, and then they say, hey, there's some context, there's some history here to this problem, and I think it might be repeating. Let me go check if that's the case. And in this scenario, we have probably saved a whole lot of time and problems with getting everyone involved, because we were unaware of this context, but we asked the right question to the right person. They were aware of the context of this problem. So shared understanding. So we're asking questions, getting people to think about it, but usually in these kind of situations, there's information coming in as you're going, because everyone is all on board at the very beginning, all hands on deck, but information trickles in. And so this is a very important way to work through that, because what you want to do is you want to create a shared understanding of the who, what, and when, get a scope of the situation. And when it comes to this kind of stuff, you create your problem statement at the very beginning. It's very broad. You say some process went down, right? But as information comes in, it's very important to use yes or no questions to clarify when the problem statement changes, right? Because what we're going for here is that situation, and maybe this has happened to you on one of these calls, or maybe you said something that this happened with someone else, but it's trying to create that light bulb moment. Once you create a clear understanding of the definition, there's probably someone who knows, oh, I know what that is. Now that I understand what's going on, I know exactly what this problem is. It's that, I've got it. And that's what we're trying to get to using yes or no questions. We're trying to get down into our specifics. So questions like, does this affect every one of our users? Is this a broad thing, or maybe it's just happening to a subsection, and maybe that one subsection, there's something different about that subsection. So that's why yes or no questions, we start to clarify. We start thinking, oh, so you're saying it's affecting these people. And they say yes. So whenever something changes on our problem statement to everyone is down, and you find out no, we use yes or no questions to get more specifics. And then we also want to start asking questions about quantifiability, get more specifics about, are all systems down, get a number, get get a specific time. We thought this was happening at 12, but it looks like users haven't been able to access a certain part of a thing since 6 p.m. the day before, and that changed it. 12, maybe a service went down, but the problem started around 6. Maybe there was a buildup of the system and you're not looking at the right problem. What the real problem was is something happened at 6 p.m. the day before the service crashed. That was the cause of the crash, like what the actual issue is, and using that quantifiability helps with that. And then of course we want to use the terms. We want to have defined terms that everyone on the call understands. So if there's ever a question of like someone uses a term you're unfamiliar with, well, let's establish what that means. Maybe you call something by a certain name, but that's only one part of that process, and that the system as a whole is actually called this, and maybe the process that you're calling it is confusing because that's actually not what the problem is. It's actually this section. Maybe you're like, well, it's the transactions, and they're like, well, technically it's not the transactions, it's a specific part of this process. And just make sure that everyone is on the same page and they all understand what we're talking about when we're talking about our problem statements, and everyone's using familiar terms and everyone agrees what those terms mean. And then of course, every time that there is a change to the understanding, we want to restate the problem. And so you start quantifying, like as you stated last night, this happened around 11 p.m. Eastern, in this situation. And so then we restate the problem. So 11 p.m. processes stop working for customers at a very specific time zone. And so we get very specific about what the problem is in hopes that after we start quantifying, we start being more specific. Someone can be like, oh, well, people in that time zone around that time, those customers at that particular time, well, there's a separate process that runs for them, and it must have been something that's related to that. Because once we start establishing that problem and people are thinking about the situation, you can go, oh, well, we know this is different about that. And this is, once again, something you can do as information starts to trickle in, especially with lots of different logs and lots of different technologies. As you're starting to get that, you want to make sure that you're creating that shared understanding so everyone is on the same page. And so a summary of figuring out the problem in order to find the answer inside of a crisis situation is being prepared for that crisis. Know who or know where the documentation is for yourself. Know where the logs are. Know who knows who the logs are. Know how to get external people that might be needed on the call and how to communicate with them and ask them questions. Open those channels of communication. And of course, getting everyone in and start asking the right questions. And so in order to get to the right answer, we avoid whys, we avoid interruptions, and we let people talk and use questions that help them focus on the problem, and then use questions to establish, as information comes in, that shared understanding so everyone knows what the problem is. There is a clear defined problem statement that is happening, that's quantifiable, and can lead to people and then asking the right questions so people can give us the information that we need to be like, oh, so that's the problem. And that way we can find the answer. We can find the person who knows the answer, right? But sometimes things aren't so simple. In today's world, applications are online, we've got multiple APIs, third-party tools, and hosting services all involved within our broader application. So of course we don't have our know-it-all wizards as we usually do, or at least they're becoming a rare breed. And so let's talk about some of the things we can do specifically for navigating through all those, troubleshooting the myriad of applications, and support our running of our product when it comes to all the layers, the APIs that we have to go through. We will cover this in 3 different parts as well. This is how documentation is your friend when it comes to this. A little bit of recap from before. Things to consider when troubleshooting with APIs and various technologies, and then adding a step to our troubleshooting that would help us out, especially in the information gathering stage while we're in those situations about eliminating variables, and how this is useful later on when we're trying to talk about the real problem. And so APIs, errors, and logs. And so let's revisit our previous discussion about this. Now, let's make it a little more complicated with our layers of software, right? A little more nuanced here. So when it comes to a situation where there's a problem, not only do we need to know where the error messages are, we also need to know things like what do those errors mean? Who would know what those errors mean? What do they really mean? Like when we start talking about when it comes to problems and applications, that kind of stuff, an error message is one thing, but if there's documentation to back up, maybe with some suggestions, maybe there's knowledge base articles, maybe there's some sort of thing to help you tip you in the right direction of what that problem actually means. And so those are your friends when it comes to these kind of situations. Logging and trying to turn that on, knowing where that is. More specifics, and people who are familiar with these processes should be familiar with where the logging is, because what our overall goal here when we start talking about all these layers is to try and peel back layers. And so really when it comes to situations, we want to be able to determine who's a problem and who's not, who is on our side, who's working as expected, and who is not working as expected and causing some issues. Do we have a monitoring tool for this situation? That might be very helpful, so we can determine what is actually what's been going on with that. If we have some sort of legacy information with that, it helps us determine in a time, because a lot of those questions that I had in my parts for the demonstration, those can be, we're taking for granted the fact that we can find out that information. So we want to make sure that all this stuff is available and is on and working when it comes to all the different layers of tools that we will be using inside of our application. Remember to keep them, to remember how to pull them up, and keep a checklist of where they are when this happens. And so one of the biggest problems when we come to APIs and layers is what changed, because when we ask that question, nothing's changed that we know of, but that doesn't mean nothing has changed, because things get new installations, new patches, new updates to things. Anything could cause something to change, right? And it might not be something that's directly involved in your application altogether. There's also the OS it runs on, whether virtual or a physical OS. And then of course there's malware, firewall updates. Any of these can cause issues, things to change permissions, things to change how something functions. And so we have to be aware of all software patches. And if you have someone on your team who keeps track of all these things, that would be ideal, because they are the person you want to have that you can ask what happened, because what happened is knowing the what is a big part, especially when it comes to APIs. And you can get someone who truly knows, well, what has changed on that? Well, nothing on this end. And to help you kind of weed out and navigate all those layers of issues that can happen. Another thing that can happen is monitoring tools are useful to know, hey, has something just simply gone down? Is something not working? Is the application hanging because one of the services that we rely on, that we ping inside of our application, is just sitting there timing out because that thing has gone away? And so things to consider: is there a way to figure out if a service has gone down? Do you have like a Postman or a ping way to, software that can just go out and check? Is there monitoring tools? Especially with Synergy, we have monitoring tools for services such as Exaserver Plus, to see if those services are up and running. And so those kind of tools are important to have available and know someone who knows how to use them, right? This is the way to kind of figure out those, peel back those layers and determine, like, well, what is working, what's not working, right? Because that's what we have to do in this day and age of all these layers of product that help us create the best experience for our users, right? And so the technique we can look back, we can do from having this information, when we start monitoring, getting all the information we can and having that information available, is we can start seeing what is involved and what's not involved. And if something isn't involved, is there a way to turn it off? Do you have configuration files? Is there something you can do to just be like, well, don't use that layer, because we know that layer is fine and we're trying to determine the problem, and so let's turn that off and see if the problem's still happening. And this is a good way to kind of peel back and really simplify things. I know with a lot of our stuff, like with Exaserver Plus, if you can take that out of, that's one of our first, like, can you take that out of the equation? Can you just run that code on the server side by itself without the front end? With that communication layer, does the problem still happen? And that kind of determines that Exaserver Plus is not involved in that problem. And so same thing here, especially when it comes to internet technologies, things going back and forth between that layer of an API interface there, right? But you start to eliminate these kind of problems so that you can really picture it as a whole of what the actual problem is, and determining what is the real factor here. And then of course, don't underestimate your human resources, people who have that information available, and especially when it comes to people who run the application, people who can tell you how that stuff works, people who have knowledge of what touches what and where is very useful. And we want to make sure that even when it comes to this, and we'll kind of talk about this when it comes to finding the real problem, some of the issues are that maybe something is too involved in these processes, and when it comes to situations like this, we want to make sure that everything's modularized so we can turn APIs off. I mean, wouldn't it be glorious if we know there's a problem, we just start flipping switches to see, well, if we turn this off, is it still happening? Yes. Okay, what about this switch? Yes. This switch, no, it stopped happening. Oh, okay, well, maybe that's what's involved in the problem. And so that kind of helps you navigate API layers and gives you that important, like, let's eliminate some of these variables. Let's make sure there's not so many layers to go through that our application could be causing potential problems. And we can get down to the real problem, and we can do this for troubleshooting purposes. So just a quick recap: using errors logs, monitoring, finding people that know what's going on, what changes on a system, because changes can come from the most unexpected place, and logs are very helpful for this, or error logs if because sometimes the problem is a little more subtle. It's down there. There's something that's just screaming out, hey, I'm having a lot of problems. And we're not seeing that because all we're seeing is an application hang or something, or slowness. So many times we've had issues where slowness is happening and there is a log somewhere on some technology they're using that's going, hey, I can't get to a socket. I keep timing out. And like every other 10th transaction just ends up timing out, which causes even more delay, and it's a knock-on effect. So we want to make sure we have all that. And then in order to kind of get to the bottom of these kind of problems, we want to be able to say, okay, well, it's not this. So can we turn that off? Can we bypass that? So then we can see if that layer is no longer, if that layer is no longer in play, does the problem keep happening? And, know how we can modularize that kind of stuff. So. But what is the actual problem? Because once the crisis is averted and a patch or a fix is implemented, what can we learn from this situation? When a problem arises, it can reveal opportunities for hardening our system, for making sure that that thing doesn't happen again, for a chance for improvement. So let's talk about finding the real problem. And we'll be doing this in another 3 parts. This is identifying what kind of a problem we have, techniques that we can use to dig down to the root of the problem, and then creating a solution. And so first, what kind of a problem did we have? Because of course the fix doesn't end with just a fix. Maybe something was running and it's been fixed, but the fix is mostly just a band-aid to make sure that it isn't bleeding at the moment. But how do we get it to stop bleeding, again? First, is it a problem that is repeatable? Is it something that we can research and explore more in a safe test environment or something like that? You can consult something where we can consult logs that maybe weren't on during the live problem that happened before. Is there, is this something that happened because of a design decision? Is the problem something that happens because of the way this program is designed, that it's created this vulnerability inside of the product? It's just something that's a little shaky because of something we can do. So we want to start looking at, the design decisions that were made with requirements. Maybe there's something there that we can use to improve. And then did the fix we put in, is it solving the right problem? Like maybe the fix we went in, it just is fixing just a symptom, but the real problem is something even deeper, right? We want to dig down, find what the actual issue is, because if we're just solving symptoms, we're not actually addressing the real problem that we could probably improve to make our system even better, right? Because we want to be looking at these problems as an opportunity for growth. So what do we want to do when asking the real problem? Well, now the question why comes into place. So we want to start pulling back our focus, and we want to look at the process as a whole, like look at the whole situation, and even the API layers and all that. We want to look at everything that is involved in this and then start asking the why. And when we're asking the whys, we start hitting on processes, not people. We're not being like, well, why is this happening? Oh, because so-and-so doesn't have the right training. Well, then we can start asking, like, why do they not have the right training? Maybe there's something there. Maybe there's a human element that that needs to be fixed. But it's not the human itself, it's the process of our human resources and how their understanding is or how they're trained, because we're focusing on the process here when we start digging into it. And then of course, because I mean it was so and so this time, but it could have been someone else, the next time. So maybe there's a chance for growth there. And we want to keep digging, and if we ever hit into that, that the purpose, we want to look at the purposes over the tradition, because if we hit that area where someone says, oh, because we've always done it that way, then that's something that gives us a lot of opportunity to start looking into, like, why was it done that way? Why is this just tradition? Maybe the reason it's done that way no longer exists, and gives us an opportunity to redesign or fix the requirements for the application to really make an improvement, because that thing happened because we do it this way, but maybe we don't have to do it that way. And then once you start doing your 5 whys, you want to restate the problem from a more broad focus of, why do we do it this way? Well, it's because, the requirements say that we need to do this, and, very, very broad scope. It says we need to do this because we need this to happen. Like, this is the reason this is the way it is. So our statement becomes, instead of this happened at this time and that kind of those specifics, we start talking about, like, this happened because it was designed this way, or we need it this way, or it's because some unexpected thing happened. It's not supposed to behave that way. You want to have it restated from that purpose. So kind of a sample of what we're talking about here is, instead of looks like we back up and running after changing permissions on the file. So why did the file permissions change, right? So we start looking at the broader sense, because this, crisis is over. We start asking the whys. Security updates from IT. Why is IT running security updates? It's for the operating system. They run every weekend during the maintenance window. Why does it affect permissions of the data files? Well, we store that data in a directory that contains other server essential files. And so because of this has caused permission changes, right? And so then, why are we storing data in that directory? And then we can finally get to and this was only 4 whys, but I know those counting, but it becomes, not sure, probably convenient for how the environment is set up. And you go, hey, maybe that's an opportunity. We can put this somewhere else. Maybe that even helps us with our application and modularizing it, because everything is contained within its own space on the server rather than them being intermixed with other files there. We have a chance for improvement here. And so that's how our why questions can help us dig down to the real problem. The real problem is that files are in a folder that isn't contained and controlled exclusively by our application. And so you can kind of see the power there on finding our real problem. And so then we also want to start looking things from a new perspective. If we start digging into the problem, we start doing things like, well, let's redefine the problem. Once you start thinking about that, instead of saying, well, we need to design a better mousetrap, we need to design our application to not fall over, we start asking things like, well, we need a better way to keep rodents out. We need a better way to just stop this from happening altogether. We need a better design to avoid this issue. Maybe there's a better way to do that. Maybe if we employed a different kind of software, or we employed a recommendation on resilient software to make it not fall over, because the issue isn't so much as there was a delay or there was a lag on the thing. Maybe it's more like, well, how do we get it to not rely so heavily on that technology so it doesn't lag, right? And then we want to look for multiple perspectives. We want to talk to everyone involved in the process. If there is one specific process that's having the issues, well, let's find out how everyone's using it. Let's find out what the actual requirements is and what the actual use cases are for that part of the product. And then this helps us find the deeper problem. So after we've reworked it, we've redefined the problem, once again come up with that problem statement so we can help and try and find the true purpose of this process. This is the because. So we've asked the whys, we know why the problem happened, and we say because from our perspective, like it's because we need to find a better way to keep those rodents out, right? We need to find a better way to do things. And so just some samples of how that works, because I mean, even for me, it's a little bit confusing on how this works in purpose. Like, yeah, it's great you can say, let's redefine our perspective, but what does it actually mean? So something like we need to stop hardware failure turns into, well, how do we stop our processes from being affected by hardware failure? How do we make it more resilient for that? Because I mean, hardware failure, you can't stop hardware from breaking. That is wear and tear. That's how that happens. Even with brand new things, it might has defects. And so, instead of thinking about from the hardware failure perspective, we're thinking about like, well, what can we do with our processes? So in case of hardware failure, we can plan around that and maybe even have redundant systems and that kind of stuff. How do we detect data corruption can turn into how do we build a resilient system that prevents data corruption from even happening? Why is the data corruption happening? Well, maybe it's just the way we are handling the data and we can redesign it so it doesn't happen. And then how do we program around internet interruptions? Well, maybe instead of doing everything over being interpreted reliant on an internet connection, we try and make it so everything does as much processes locally before, and we make the actual internet, the actual connection stuff as minimal as possible, right? And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about different perspectives and kind of broadening our question, like rephrasing it to like well, what is really the purpose of this? What are we actually trying to accomplish rather than just looking at it from the very simple problem statement? And so then what we're all really trying to do is we're just trying to find the root of this problem. We've got our tree of problems and we're just trying to find the root. Like what is the actual like deep rooted issue that, could possibly be something if we just make a slight fix there can help us prevent this problem from happening. So we want to start looking at stuff like what is the primary problem, contributing factors. We want to start thinking about what is all being touched inside of this process to kind of help us with this situation. And also who knows this problem. We want to start getting to know the people who actually know the subject matter and ask them the tough hitting why questions of like, why was it this way, what was the thoughts, what was the processes, and not not in an accusatory way, but in a truly understanding why something is done the way it is, so then we can get to the actual meat of the problem, get down into the root of it all. And then once we have our problem statement, this happens because it's designed this way or whatever, it's time for some innovation. This is the time to start being curious, start asking questions about like the possible connections of the process and how this is influenced by other processes. Really think about the whole like how the whole thing is structured together, and then start thinking of questions like what if we did X instead of Y? Well, start brainstorming like what if we started doing this instead of that type of questions. And we're just looking for, well, if we started doing this, then this would happen, but then it would affect so and so. So we want to make sure we're aware of those connections, and that's best done by our previous steps of talking to people, right? And then after we do all that, we want to do the check. Like, so the first thing we want to do is, well, does this change that I'm thinking of, this innovation, is this going to resolve the original problem? Does this actually address our original problem statement of this happened because it's designed this way? Well, if I make this change, will it solve the this happened part of our problem statement, right? And then you start thinking about, well, who is this going to impact? Well, if we make this change, if we decide to do things this way, well, who's going to be the one who has to implement that? Who's going to be the one that knows, the people that you've been talking to about this, has some buy-in because they're the ones that told you, well, this is how this works. This is helped you dig into what the actual problem was. And then, of course, who's going to resist this problem? Well, is it going to cause a problem with customers if there's a change like this? Is it, is it going to be risky? Like, what's the risk averse way of doing this? Like, be ready for those kind of issues when you're thinking about your problem that you're trying to solve. Like, so you have an answer to all those likely questions that are going to come up. And then the last one is to write down your plan, champion your cause, try to make that change, because every change needs someone behind it. And as your change is being put forward, you want to make sure that you're adapting and growing your plan to work out as more information comes, and to keep going through that process of continually making sure that you're addressing the original problem and making that change so then the solution will resolve the real problem and avoid those crisis like situations in the future. In summary of this, for finding our real problem, think about the type of a problem. Is it just is it a problem that happened because, our was the fix just a band-aid? Is there a deeper rooted problem, like it's going to happen again? Is it repeatable? Is it something that is going to just keeps coming up? Or is it maybe a problem that happened because the requirements were wrong? Or is it a problem that happened because there's just no redundancy, no planning for a fault of something unexpected happening? And then really think about the root, try to restate the problem, ask the 5 whys, ask people about their perspective of how this process works, and try and dig into why the process works the way it does. What are the requirements that were put into it, and that kind of stuff. And then, championing your change and making that change happen. So then you don't have to be sitting there on those crisis calls because you've got a change that will fix something. Because maybe you'll end up just running into some sort of, well, we've always done that way, and it turns out the reason you did it that way is because it's no longer needed, right? So great way to harden your systems and really help out, like maybe it's even a better user experience and that kind of stuff by making those changes, right? And so, in summary of everything we talked about today, so we want to prepare for that time of crisis. We want to have our tools ready, which consists of our documentation, our people. We know where the logs are. We know who knows what, and that kind of stuff. We know what kind of information we know how to make changes to our APIs when needed, and so we can turn them on and off. If possible, we can mess with them to make little changes to those layers that kind of peel them off and determine like what's the actual problem. And of course, we have our documentation to see if something's been calling out for help the whole time. And then we want to get everyone together. We want to start asking them about like the good questions, avoiding the why at this point, and asking questions that help prompt thought and responses and focus on the problem at hand. And then we want to, once the crisis is averted and we've discovered the problem that happened, we want to ask, well, is that the real problem, or is this something deeper? Is this a design thing, or is this something that we can research further and look into, and maybe it's a bug report we need to send out to someone, and then we start thinking about like what would be great to actually implement as a way to harden our system so that this problem doesn't happen again. And so I hope this has kind of helped you prepare for issues that might happen as we've been going through. It's really helped me out with asking these kind of questions and thinking about like what am I actually thinking about, because a lot of these times we go in completely blind about what's the situation is. But as long as you're asking the right questions and keeping the conversation moving, you can start helping people help prompt them into finding the problem that is actually happening. And so I'm hoping this is helpful. And with that, who has the first question?
I've got one question here. What if the technology you're using doesn't have robust logging or monitoring available?
Oh, yeah. So we've run across this one a couple of times. With that kind of a situation, it's very important with the lack of logs or any sort of thing like that to try and keep in mind what is available, if there's some sort of support or any sort of resources available for that. That's where the essential, where if you can take out the process, turn it off, becomes even more apparent. If there's some way to isolate the incident into a separate machine, which might be part of the process afterwards, after you get up and running. But this does happen. I was pleased to see that Harmony Core is going to be getting some more logs and stuff. I'm like super excited. I'm like, yes, more logs, monitoring. I do love all those kind of things. Error logs are just such a godsend. So
Here's another one here. What if the software or service can't be disabled for troubleshooting?
Right. So then, of course, you got the flip side of what if something can't be turned off. A lot of the times when troubleshooting, you do see that there are ways to try to sidestep or fully monitor one interaction to another. The big one that comes to mind for me is always web technologies. When you start looking at like if packets being passed back and forth, and you're like, well, we can't take out that the web specific part of this, right? And so what you end up doing is you get like a packet sniffer or something, and you just make sure that everything is clean on one end, and then you can kind of like keep your mind at ease, like, oh, that part's good, we're fine there. So it's all really about thinking about ways of where things touch and interact. So yeah, great question.
We've also got a question here in the Q&A section from Adam Collar. He says, documentation is vital. What types of methodologies, processes, et cetera, do you use to ensure documentation is actively reviewed and enhanced?
Oh, it's actually a great question. So for me, I do find that it really depends on your methodologies and when it comes to methodologies and processes. What I like to do is I like to keep a catalog, a list that's available for the entire team to know where documentation is available for everything there is there. But also I keep like an internal KB or something within like my group. So our development team has kind of a supplement for the documentation that has links and that kind of stuff. It has very specific, like, here's the scenario, here's what you need to do, and this kind of thing. And I find those kind of like lists or troubleshooting guides really help for like on the call. I'm like, oh shoot, it's this scenario. I don't remember what I'm supposed to do in this situation, and so I like to keep those handy, and then to ensure that they are actively reviewed and enhanced. Like every time one of those is done, we're like, okay, is there something we can document? Is there anything that changed in the process during this? I wish I could be more proactive on it. Be like when something changes in the process and I think about it beforehand. I do admit I'm not perfect about that. I go, wait, that changes this whole thing. I need to go update documentation. But for me, it's mostly just you want to keep up on it anytime anything's changed. It kind of reminds me of the problem statement. Like every time something is changed with the status quo or something with your situation, make sure the documentation reflects those changes. I know a lot of people keep them versioned. We don't. We just have an ongoing KB type of situation that has all the possible things for all the possible versions, but that kind of works for us since we do from occasion get stuff from time to time that are lower versions of Synergy and that kind of thing. So lower product versions. So, but it just really depends on your situation, but hopefully that helps.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our conference sessions today. And please be sure to join us tomorrow for our next two sessions, which are going to be deploying Synergy with Kubernetes and leveraging web services for UI. So you guys are definitely going to want to check those out. So please meet us here tomorrow morning for those. Thank you again, Phil, for your excellent presentation, and we'll see everyone tomorrow.
See y'all.